think this is probably the most beautiful fruit that there is, actually, pomegranate. These seeds are like rubies. My story that I'm going to tell today centers around pomegranate. Actually, not pomegranate itself, but 6 of the seeds. And the old stories say that actually in the Garden of Eden, it wasn't the apple that tempted Eve, but in fact the pomegranate. They didn't have apples in Iraq at that time. And it was a pomegranate that actually tempted her. And looking at the fruit, I can actually understand that. This is a story about 3 people and a fatal love, a love that perhaps attracted them too much. One is a young woman by the name of Percy, and her mother, Demetria, and the man who lived in a castle across the seas in a cold and gloomy place where there's fog everywhere. His name is Hadrian. And the mother loved her daughter so much, past the point of devotion, even to the point of obsession, I would say. And as Shakespeare said, she loved her not well, but too much. Demetria was one of those women that we all know who could garden. She was an amazing gardener. She could grow anything. And she lived in southern France, in the area around Grasse, where perfume was invented. Lavenders there, purple fields everywhere. And there really are no seasons there. It's always summer, and always there are things growing in her garden. She could grow rutabagas and roses and raspberries. Apple orchards were famous, and she had vineyards everywhere. And she was a great baker. She was always covered in flour, and her cheeks were often red from her oven. She'd been hurt very badly by men, though, and so she kept kind of solitary. And the only thing she loved more than her garden was her daughter, Percy. And Percy was one of those beautiful young women. She reached her perfection about the age of 9. She was lithe and willowy. She had golden hair, and her eyes were the color of lapis lazuli. I can pass it around. Lapis lazuli, I found out last week, is characterized by the fact there are gold flecks in it. Her eyes had gold flecks in it. She was, as she grew into womanhood, she was more beautiful, more willowy, more lithe, and more graceful with time. And her mother became worried and tried to keep her away from men and to warn her about men. She kept her in the garden there. And in the summertime, in a June night, the wind would be blowing, and Percy would go out there and dance. Her mother would watch, worried, from the summer kitchen, a famous rhubarb pies, rhubarb strawberry pies cooling on the cold stones there. She'd watch in a worried way as her daughter danced. Someone else was watching also. It was a dark man. He had dark hair and wore a dark suit. Looked like he came from a foreign country. In fact, that's what Demetria called him. She called him a foreigner because he had this dark look about him. He lived from an injury that he had in the war. You could see her from the path. He used to come in the late summer to get grapes. He loved this dark blood red wine that he would make. And he'd come and buy the grapes from Demetria. And once she saw that her daughter had been noticed by this man, she became very worried, and she moved her upstairs and kept him in the house all summer. Of course, Percy would leave the window, and she noticed the man, his gold satchel and the servant, taking the grapes back home to ferment this wine down in the caves there, to take a boat home. And he noticed her also. Demetria was less worried in the wintertime, so she'd allow her to stand in the garden wall. And on the solstice, the full moon one night, she was standing at the gate, and suddenly he was there. She turned because she was frightened. She did not want to hurt her mother. She knew that if she did anything, she would break her mother's heart. And as she turned, though, she realized that he was standing there, and he offered her in his hand a pomegranate. And she turned, but then she turned back, and she reached out and grabbed the pomegranate, and it was gone. It was done. Like a dream, she left. She walked with him down to his boat, and they took off across the sea. He lived north of the Hebrides, where my ancestors come from. And he lived in a castle. It did have indoor plumbing and electricity, and there was a heated outdoor pool, but it was a castle nonetheless. And it rained all the time there. There was never any sun. It was always cloudy and foggy. There's romantic waves crashing on the shore. It got a little tedious after a while. And all that grew there were about thin barley wheat that he made his porridge out of. And he ate venison. His servant would go out into the heather and the lavender and the thistles, the national flower, and would hunt deer. And Percy had fallen in love with him. His name was Hadrian, by the way. Percy had fallen in love with him because because of his sadness. He was perpetually sad. This was a very sad man. And in fact, death was all around him, in fact. His family all died. His parents had died, his brothers and sisters. Even his daughter from the previous marriage was dead. She died of tuberculosis, like a heroine in one of those Puccini operas in the late 1800s, where everyone dies, seems to die of tuberculosis. At first, Percy was in love with this sadness, but then it began to overwhelm her. It began to seep into her. She became more and more withdrawn herself. She felt like Ophelia drowning in a pool of blackness with the memory of those beautiful flowers from southern France somewhere in the background. She began to become very thin, and her golden hair turned into a straw color, and her blue lapis lazuli blue eyes became kind of pale blue. When she walked by that heated pool in moonlight, she could see a reflection of herself, and her ribs were showing. Even Hadrian was worried for her life. And he finally agreed to allow her to go back to southern France next time when he went to collect the grapes. When she arrived there, she had already promised herself she wasn't going back to Hadrian. And she went into the garden, and everything was overgrown with weeds. Weeds everywhere, nothing was growing, everything was brown, and a dust storm had destroyed the apple orchards. And she looked for her mother. Found her mother in the root cellar. A few rutabagas left, and she had become an old woman in that interval, withered and wrinkled. And the first thing that Percy did was to go out into the garden with a rake and a chainsaw. She was good at the chainsaw, actually. And she cut down some of the dead wood, and she planted the garden again. Peat bogs and peat moss she put back, and it turned it into a dark, rich soil again. And later and she walked Hadrian down to the boats and said she wasn't coming back, and he left with his big caskets of blood and wine to go back to his place way in the northern seas. And the next spring, the first shoots of the rose bushes began to come up. She brought her mother out and put her into the lawn chair, and the sunflowers began to shoot up all over her, all around her. And finally, for the first time in years, the little pink came back into the cheeks of her mother, Demetria. And Persephone vowed to herself she could not break her mother's heart. She would never, never leave again. Later that fall, of course, she had the last ripe tomato in her hand. The rest were out drying in the sun for sun-baked tomatoes, sun-baked tomatoes later on that winter. She was standing there in the moonlight, and he was there again. She turned, because she did not want to go with him. She turned to go back in again, but she made the fatal mistake of turning back one more time, and there he was. He offered her pomegranate again. She reached, it was too late once again.